Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Philip Blair. I'm a family practitioner by training, and I want to talk to you about cannabidiol. This week's talk is about the evidence for cannabidiol. I want to go over some of the literary sources as well as some of the evidence that is contained there. I want to give you a good idea of how you can find the evidence and locate it and make the connections that I frequently do on how cannabidiol will work and will it work in different situations. Unfortunately, we don't get much in the way of dosage ideas, and that's going to have to come from your experience. So I'm going to try to keep this talk to a limited period of time because I know your time is extremely valuable. So let's go ahead and we'll move on. So these are the main topics that we're going to cover. In fact, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the topics in themselves in terms of which terms are being used and sort of what they mean and try to sort some of those things. We're going to talk about where to search and where to find the evidence that you're looking for and the connections that you need for how you practice and the diseases that you encounter. We're going to talk about some of the major areas of interest of when you're looking for these searches, as well as understanding pathways. Now, pathways are a key connection issue, and I'm going to show you how to make those connections with those pathways to see how CBD can work in different situations. You know, on a daily basis, I'm coming in contact with different types of situations, diseases I've never heard of, and how do you deal with those? I get onto the internet and I explore the literature. I look at a number of different things, but before I do that, let me just talk about some of the topics and the terms that we're using here because they can be quite confusing. Now, I talk about ligands, and so the ligands are the molecules like CBD, but also like THC that connect up with the receptors. And these, then of course, there are the metabolizers that either degrade and break down the cannabinoid, or they actually form and they actually make up the cannabinoid. So, and there's other molecules that are involved with this. In addition, of course, there are the endocannabinoids. Those are the substances that we circulate within our body. Who would have figured that we had our own cannabinoid system right within us, circulating to all parts of our body, and basically performing the fine-tooth controls that we need to maintain homeostasis, a balanced and effective life, and avoid disease. Now, when we're talking about the endocannabinoids specifically, we're talking about anandamide and 2-AG, and when we're talking about some of the receptors, there are much more than just the cannabinoid 1 and the cannabinoid 2 receptors. There's a number of other ones that are being located and identified. And so I just listed a couple of those, the GPR55 and the TRPV 1 through 4. And these are very specific receptors that work in many different parts of the body and on many different systems. And then one last one I just point out to you, and this is the PPAR receptor, and that's actually located at the nucleus of the cell. So yeah, we have cannabinoid receptors that are located in our nucleus, which is a great target for cannabidiol specifically, working on the PPAR receptors. And these receptors are involved with changing the DNA dynamics, so you're getting your epigenetic changes that occur that can be lasting not only for that individual, but for generations, perhaps. Don't have good, strong information on that at this point. So I want to move on to talk about where would you search for the different subjects that you're looking at. And I'll give you some examples, but the first place I go when I encounter an exotic condition, I want to learn very quickly what that is all about. Actually, I find that Wiki the encyclopedia is very effective for getting an overview of the condition, as well as looking for some of the pathways or mechanisms that are involved with that disease. I'll also get an idea about what therapies have been used, and it's a beautiful summary, and it's something that I can help the patient understand, as well as I can reorient myself. In addition, of course, I mentioned that there are some of the mechanisms that are involved with it, and I'll show you how they come into play. Of course, there's Pubmed, which has the incredible data trove that we have for all the medical software. That's understood. Now, I list OnePlus here because you never have to worry about getting access to the whole article and the full text. This comes with OnePlus. They're always free, and they're always accessible. You can read the whole article online. So it's a particularly valuable journal that you can use, and they have a lot of great topics and information that's coming through that particular journal. In addition, of course, there's Google, and you'll find, search out different topics, and you'll find where different articles are located. And you'll also find a lot of people who have written about that particular subject. But my experience with a lot of the website, especially the medical websites, is that it's very difficult to navigate through them. And with the pop-ups and the advertisements and all of the other stuff, it's not very effective for me. And I'd rather avoid what someone else is saying about the substance or disease and try to go to something really quite general, and then dig down into the literature specifically for those issues and those pathways and things that I really want to look at. Of course, it's great if you have a medical library, because you can have, maybe there's a medical librarian there who can help you and guide you, as well as pull articles for you. And that's kind of a special resource. I've been able to connect with a gentleman who is nearby, about 20 miles, at a medical library, and he provides all of my journals without charge and over the internet. So I rarely have to go in and see him, and most of it is an exchange on electronic mail. And then just one website I want to list here is projectcbd.org, and the org is important, or you won't find it. Project CBD is a website that was actually sponsored and created by Dr. Russo. And of course, I list him below as one of the pioneers in CBD research. Well, all of the cannabinoids, but in particular, an emphasis on the CBD, naturally, because that's the healing cannabinoid that we know so much about and is so particularly effective. And of course, I've got Dr. McCoolum there, and Pertwee is a name of one individual that comes up repeatedly in the cannabis literature and the cannabinoid literature. I got a name drop, so there's my name drop for you. When we're talking about the areas of interest, when we're talking about studies and looking at studies, I just kind of outlined the areas that we look at in terms of human, animal, cell culture, and the preclinical. Of course, these are the ones that are done on the animal and cell culture. It's the acronym that they use for that. And then the clinical studies are the ones characteristically that are human studies. Just for you to get an idea. And of course, we have the randomized controlled trials, and then we've got the regular trials that are out there and the studies that are done, as well as case studies where individual cases are discussed, or maybe it's a collection of cases where someone has had an experience with treating a particular problem in a particular way. Always there are reviews, and then I want to move on to pathways. But here's my problem with the reviews. The reviews don't generally have any evidence of themselves. They're just taking the literature and have collected the literature in a particular way and trying to get across some point that they're trying to push. And I find in many cases that they don't offer any new information. So reviews are not at the top of the list unless they present some new concepts. And there are some very good articles that present new concepts. Dr. Russo, in his review of clinical endocannabinoid deficiencies, I think it was a superb overview as well as the care and feeding of the endocannabinoid system by McPartland. Both these authors have done a great job of reviewing the literature, and what a great resource for finding other connections to what you might be looking for in terms of specifics that your information and studies that you're trying to connect with. So looking at some of those studies, maybe it's not the article or the title that you're really after, but because of the references, it can be really valuable for you to link up and find something that is connecting, that does approach and does address the issues that you have a particular interest in. So if you're looking at PubMed and you do a search, and I'm regularly doing these on a weekly basis, taking a look, you'll find that in PubMed, if you look up cannabidiol, you've got about 1,629 references that are there. Now, not all of those references are something that you want to read or you want to get into, but it does give you an idea about the total volume of cannabinoid literature or cannabidiol literature. Now, if you're looking at the endocannabinoid system, you'll see that there are 7,800, or a little bit over that. Now, this particular topic is growing quite rapidly, probably about 100 studies per month. So pretty good growth rate going on when these. Cannabidiol is also growing at a much slower rate, but it continues to increase. Now, if you combine the cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, and you put those together, you get about 2,300 studies. And now, but if you're only looking at human studies, there are only, that I found, were 740 of the human studies alone. And if you're really looking for randomized controlled trials dealing with cannabidiol, there's only 29 that I located. There may be more out there, but there's a very, very small number of randomized controlled trials, and that's where we're running into a lot of problem in providing really solid evidence to support cannabidiol for legal issues and for authorizations and for approval in different ways. Unfortunately, the National Institute of Drug Abuse has actually put a lot of barriers on doing any research with any of the cannabinoids, the phytocannabinoids. So it's really been a problem in terms of getting those randomized controlled studies done that could really make a point and provide solid evidence. Now, in addition to what we have with regard to cannabidiol and the endocannabinoids, there's also artificial cannabinoids that the pharmaceutical industry has been working on. Now, when the pharmaceutical industry makes an artificial cannabinoid, they find where it can connect into the pathways and the mechanisms, but to date, for the most part, those have failed. And they have failed because the substances alone seem to have adverse effects when they're taken out of context. If they're not with a whole plant substance, then they could push the endocannabinoid system or the other systems of the body too far in one direction, and that creates a complication, a severe toxicity, as we've seen in a number of instances. There was a cannabinoid that was brought on to the formulary in 2004, and it was withdrawn after 2 years because of toxic effects. And some other cannabinoid substances that were brought from pharma have also failed and with toxicity. So definitely have to be watchful. But these are good sources for finding articles that address some of the pathways that you will be looking for. And I just want to point out, in all of these studies, I was not able to find any adverse reports on cannabidiol. There's some speculation about whether there could be some drug interactions because of the pathways that cannabidiol uses. But in fact, there were no significant adverse effects that were reported in any of the studies. So if we're looking at pathways, and I don't want you to read this definitely, but I do have a link to this particular article, a white paper that I've done. It's a living document in that I'm gathering additional pathways. Commonly, people say, well, it's got the CB1 or the CB2. Well, these are the other pathways that I have seen that have been noted in the literature in my reviews. Some of them may overlap, and maybe there aren't 52. Maybe there are more, and maybe there are less. But the point is that this is a very promiscuous molecule. It can go into many areas, and it can connect up. And I tell you, the reason why this is important because of how it connects. Now, let me show you. If you have a pathway situation, and you may not be able to find the study that shows exactly cannabidiol's connection to your disease or what you're searching for and what you're trying to find effect for. So you might find something like disease A, which is, okay, we'll call that's disease A is Crohn's disease in this case. We know that tumor necrosis factor alpha is a key element and a causative element where we've got elevated levels of this, and it leads to bowel lining, erosion, quite a bit of disease, cramping, a lot of disease. And so we're also seeing that the pharmaceutical industry has developed TNF blockers. And Enbrel is a great example, $1,000 a shot, and it works in about 30% of cases, so that's really good. But as a TNF alpha blocker, that's the mechanism that's going in it. So you really validate that this is the mechanism for and the pathway for this particular disease. Well, then your logic takes you to how can CBD affect this disease? Well, if you look at the literature, you may find that CBD is shown to be a TNF alpha blocker. And then once you can make that connection, that it is in fact using the same pathway, then there's a good bet that it's going to connect up with the disease. And it does. It does actually superbly, where CBD is effective and dramatically effective for Crohn's disease. In fact, all of the inflammatory bowel diseases, as well as many of the arthritides that use the tumor necrosis factor blocker. So now you've got something you can put your hands on that's solid, that says, okay, if I've got a TNF problem, then I know that CBD can work for me and it can correct these issues and resolve a lot of the patient's complaints. Well, now here is an interesting piece of evidence that I think should be at the top of your list. It's the Department of Health and Human Services patent that was granted in 2003 as a neuroprotectant, a cardiac protectant, and as an anti-inflammatory. And they list off some pieces of evidence, a number of pieces of evidence, but the fact that this was granted and it was accepted, as well as having a misspelling for cannabidiol. Sorry about that, guys. But they do have some interesting evidence that they have in here. This, I think, is an important piece that the government has been involved with the cannabinoids. They found it effective. On these particular significant authors were found that it to be quite a valuable substance, enough so that they would patent it for the Department of Health and Human Services. And then one other piece I think is important to recognize, and it's not exactly objective evidence, but the National Cancer Institute at the PDQ, which is your site for cancers, lists off cannabidiol and the cannabinoids in a number of different ways that emphasizes that they have been shown in some studies. As we said, that they haven't been human or randomized controlled trials, but they have shown that the cannabinoids, particularly cannabidiol, has a significant effect in terms of improving patients with cancer and the adverse effects that they have, as well as protecting them against the chemo and radiation therapy that they may be going through. I think that's a good piece of support that, once again, then our major bodies or science are recognized are significant for their importance. And I think it can be persuasive for people who are interested in cannabidiol and the use of cannabinoids within these different disease states. Now, that's the general category of, rather than me giving you a number of articles, because there are literally hundreds and thousands of articles, let me just go back to remind you about, give you a professional user's guide to cannabidiol. So I like to, these are basic principles that you can work on anybody and anything, in any situations and any disease. Now, I generally recommend starting with about 15 milligrams twice a day. If somebody, and then adjusting it boldly. And what I mean is double or half the dose on day one, depending on the response. Pick out the best formula, and that's the one that the person prefers, that fits within their lifestyle, that they're going to be taking. So that's pretty easy to do. You can find that without too much difficulty by just taking a good assessment on the patient. And then assess the patient early, because a lot of patients, as many as 50%, don't actually recognize that they've made significant improvements almost right away when they use cannabidiol. I like to have them in front of me when I give them the first dose, or I check with them on the first day, because I can point out things that they've noticed that they will discount as not being, well, it just happened that way, or it was a good day. It's not a good day. These are characteristic improvements that I see with cannabidiol. And then one other thing, if we're dealing with somebody who is under the age of 6 or over the age of 70, you may want to start with a slightly lower dose. I generally recommend saying, let's start with half of that dose, and as a starting point. And this is just a starting point. It's for you to get an understanding of how people respond. Because I want you to understand that we're also treating with the CBD an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. That seems to be a big part of what's going on with a lot of these diseases, and CBD can play a major role in bringing these people back to health. And one other reminder for you that there are 0 downsides to cannabidiol. That's why it's so easy to make bold changes in the serving sizes that patients are getting, because you're not getting adverse reactions, you're not getting toxicity, you're rarely getting any drug interactions, and there's no coagulation effects, so you're not going to interfere with any bleeding times, or if somebody is on an anticoagulant at all. So let me just go over some of the topics that we've addressed here. We've talked about some of the confusing names and the range of names that are going on, and different words that you might be wanting to use in your searches. We talked about some of the searches that are there, and using pathways to help you find those therapeutic potential for cannabidiol in the use and the bridging of health for people, to get them back to health and restoring their endocannabinoid system. And we're talking about also how those pathways can play a major role in you understanding and patients understanding, as well as finding ways that cannabidiol can be particularly successful in your practice and your experience. So last page here is, I want to give you a couple slides. One is those pathways, the white paper that I've done. You can use this particular link. You do have to be careful with it, because as a shortened link, it's not full words, and you have to get those capitals and those letter I versus letter L all straightened out. And then I've also got these slides have been set up for you to be shared at the website that's below.